He's a rabble-rouser and has been called a militant homosexualist. He's one of the more vocal voices in the LGBT community and is also the co-founder of the Inter-University LGBT Community Network. My guest today is Daryl Young. Welcome, Daryl, to Inconvenient Questions.
Thanks, Vivek. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you for being here. So let's dive right in. Recently, there have been many commentaries and opinions about how LGBTQ activism has become a domain for the rich and the privileged, that it carves out a space to bring to light the issues of only those who fit within, I guess, a certain gay ideal. What do you make of this?
So I think this traces really back to the roots of the LGBT movement. So there has always been a division in the movement between what we call the assimilationists and the liberationists. And I think what we really see today is the dominance of the assimilationist movement, which really is an attempt by those who are different only on account of their sexual orientation or gender identity and who want to fit back into society as being to be seen as normal. So because of that, they often are those who are already privileged in the sense of their race, their class, and so because they already are privileged in those ways, they don't really see how those identities also intersect with their LGBTQ identity. So we kind of have failed to take these other aspects of the movement into account, and that has really led to, I think, a much less diverse, a much less just movement, focusing really on everybody in the community. It's really, as Alfian Saad had criticized Pink Dot in the past, it's in the Singapore context at least, it's really about, the Chinese middle class, well-educated, English-speaking liberals. And I think that is a missed opportunity for us to really galvanize the larger community in our struggle for justice and equality. Yeah.
So to someone not directly involved in this particular activist movement, perhaps somebody who's on the fringe looking in, how would you explain this to them, that in the fight for equality, which essentially is what it sort of boils down to, I guess at a very superficial level, right? In the fight for equality, there seems to be a lot of inequality and unequal movements and fissures within the larger, I guess, the community in Singapore. So fighting for equality while being unequal, that conundrum, how would you explain this to someone looking in, trying to make sense of it all?
I guess it really boils down to what the ideals of the movement are. And in this case, the ideal is really inclusion of a historically excluded community. So those who are queer. And in doing that, if we only focus on those who are queer, but ignore the fact that there are also those who are queer and Malay, queer and Indian, queer and disabled, queer and poor, those who are included in what we will consider like the majority or normal or the normal society are only those who are differentiated on account of them being queer. And so we fail to also include those who are excluded from society because they are not only queer but also of a certain other marginalized identity. So I think the point really is about, as you mentioned earlier, the idea of intersectionality, that it is not possible for us to have justice and equality for everyone if we only focus on one particular identity group. And we really need to see it as something that's a lot more intersectional, something that's a lot more cross identity.
Right, but you are middle class, you are educated, you are liberally affiliated, and how do you then speak to some of that, the other micro exclusions that they're experiencing beyond just the exclusion based on their queer identity? Why are you the spokesperson for that?
I guess like the first thing I would want to do is to challenge the idea that I'm some kind of a spokesperson, because I think I can only really speak as a member of this larger community and to kind of speak to some of the issues that I see in our larger community. I think the trouble is when there is a marginalized community, outsiders often want to identify somebody as the representative, and that's always challenging, because then those who are identified as the representatives would necessarily be in certain privileged positions like I am. Yeah, and I think the obligations of having such privileges within a marginalized community is really to speak out about the fact that we are privileged, and also to use that privilege to amplify the voices of others. And I think in that way, being able to contribute to setting up the inter-university LGBT network, and really kind of creating that space for other voices to also be heard. I suppose that is how I see my role in this community. Yeah.
So let's speak a little bit more about that, about the inter-university LGBT network that you helped set up, right? What would you describe were the difficulties in mobilizing a youth movement, right? And creating specifically a youth civic consciousness, because you were also one of the founding members of CAPE, right? Committee for Advocacy and Political Education. And in doing these two sort of similar parallel movements that were, I guess, in a way, trying to achieve the same kind of stimulating consciousness effect, what were some of the impediments that you faced in a country like Singapore, who, such questions that invite a lot of scrutiny and make you step into the public spotlight, we're generally risk averse as Singaporeans. How do you contend with something like that?
So I think with kind of stimulating such conversations, I think there are barriers on a few levels. So I think one, it's on an institutional level, having kind of faced challenges from some universities who are not so comfortable having a student group focusing on LGBT issues, and also refusing to recognize or register these student organizations, thus limiting the resources that we have. So that was really one of the reasons why we set up the network, so that student groups across the universities could work together and kind of help each other out where some groups were lacking in certain resources or access. I think second is on an individual level. So like you mentioned, many people are still quite uncomfortable having these conversations. And I think what we really try to do is, by putting ourselves out there, to model to our peers that it is not something that is so taboo anymore. It's not something that is so sensitive anymore. And so hopefully through that modeling, to be able to spark other young people, to inspire other young people to also take that step in speaking out and advocating for these issues as well.
Even having something like an inter-university LGBT network, right? Does it send the signal that it demands a kind of, that there's a barrier to entry? We don't see these kind of gatherings happening in the grassroots or in other places in Singapore where that perhaps may not attract a lot of the same ilk. Does that then create an echo chamber?
It's not really so much a barrier to entry as much as I would say the beginning of a larger building of a community, and in this case kind of really very much based on the identity as a queer youth in Singapore. Yeah, and I think that speaks to the fact that there are still very much a lot of structural and institutional barriers to being able to have these conversations, being able to create these communities in the larger Singaporean community, just because it is so tightly constrained by the socio-political workings of our system.
So would you say one of these constraints is the fact that it hasn't permeated mainstream education per se? So these things still exist as silos and supplementary classes. What steps need to be taken such that there is greater integration apart from just dialogue, you say?
I think two parts to this. So I think the first is because of the dominance of the government in Singaporeans' consciousness, there's this idea that the success of any social movement is acknowledgement or recognition by the state. And so, like you mentioned, having it being mainstreamed into our education system is seen as the marker of success. But I think maybe we can push back on that and say that, maybe success can look a different way of the community working together to support each other. So I think that's one part of it. I think the second part of it is, despite having what I said, of course, mainstreaming would also be able to reach out to more people, right? And so then the question comes as to how we can go about that. I think the two are connected in the sense that once we are able to build our own community and grassroots support among ourselves, we would then be able to signal to the state that, you know, as they like to say, like our society is ready for these changes to be implemented. And I think from there, then we can see the state then taking action. So I think really it's about a paradigm shift in how we view our relationship with the state.
So just to ask maybe a concluding question to build off that, right? I want to ask you, Daryl, what drives you then when you have so many roadblocks ahead of you?
I think it's really what really drives me is my ideal vision of what our society can look like, of a community where, you know, we are not merely dependent on the state to dictate or to tell us what is in the public good and what is what ought to be done. So I think that really is what drives me, and the LGBTQ movement is the movement with which I am most affiliated with, and from which I see myself most being able to contribute to. But I think ultimately the LGBTQ movement is not merely about its own rights, its own recognition in society. I think we also have something to contribute to broadening the social political discourse in Singapore and changing our citizens' relationship with the state. And I think that is the larger contribution that our movement can have to Singapore society.
That's wonderful. And with that, thank you so much, Daryl, for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.